Oh, you got your slip.
No.
No, that's good. Okay. Yeah, that's what you go out. Okay, I'll go out. Right. A little more forward. Yeah.
Want me to move forward?
No, no.
No,
It's
talk
the,
to me.
Oh, I see.
This is your mugshot.
Okay. Focus check here.
okay. I'm making myself light. Okay.
Stan, I don't think you'd actually finished this question. Were there any flaws in Diem?
Yeah, I want to go on to that.
All right, anytime you're ready. Focus down.
Ready?
One, go.
If you could, Ed, project a little forward, and could you talk a little bit about what were the flaws in Diem, what were the shortcomings or weaknesses that contributed to his eventual downfall?
The main weakness of Northern Diem in the early days of his holding office, the highest office in the land, was that he didn't trust his subordinates to get a job done correctly. In other words, he wasn't a good executive. He tended to want to do most of the work himself, and instead of delegating it to a cabinet member, to a member of his personal staff, or someone part of the executive department. The consequence of that was he had so much on his plate that he could just get one thing done at a time and do it rather slowly, because there were other pressures on him, other interruptions all the time, and he tended to put something to one side and hold it until he could come to a resolution of the problem and to do the actual signing of things and make the final disposition of things. This, of course, left a cabinet and a group of sometimes able, sometimes not so able Vietnamese not doing their jobs, wanting to, and becoming a little resentful of being left to one side. Another thing that happened was he knew a tremendous amount about the history and topography and resources, economic resources of his land. I have never met another Vietnamese that knew as much about those subjects as he did personally. When something would happen, he would tell me not only who had been involved, but would go into a family history, tell me who the man's father was, why he had handled something the way he had, and usually go back about 200 years in history about a particular little place in Vietnam to tell me why the people felt the way they did about things, and why this man who hadn't known that had gotten in, and it was too bad that he had done what he'd done, but his father had also taught him this, and he'd go into the history. Amazing detail. So that the end result was a fascinating person to talk to, but the talk would go on and on while the kettle was boiling with political problems coming up and crisis situations and so forth, which he wasn't meeting at the time. Then he finally became busy doing his job of delegating some things and getting the papers off of his desk and working things through. But as he did that, there was suddenly missing from his life a lot of gossip about the people to keep him current with all these families that he knew and other people. And the person who supplied that was his brother New. Now, his brother New had organized intelligence services to serve the country, initially to be focused against the enemy up in Hanoi, but increasingly so, political gossip about rivals and opponents and some supporters throughout the country in South Vietnam. And I noticed, and after I'd left Vietnam in '56, and coming back on visits in later years, briefly, that the gossip about people became a little more biting when Diem would tell me, and a little more vicious about people than had ever been known before. And as a friend, I had warned him not to just rely on one source of information, but to spread it out and turn to friends as well as his brother and get different viewpoints of what was happening up in areas. And if the views became too contradictory, to get up and see something for himself. I think that towards the end of his life, he was relying a great deal on his brother New for information about a situation, to get a political feel of the feelings of the people in an area or of a group. And perhaps his brother New was a little bit captive of his own intelligence agents and people out gathering information who were sometimes self-serving. So that a wrong view came up of like the situation in a way that caused his actions against Buddhists up there that caused his final downfall. And his reactions were those of a man at the end of a long pipeline of information and seeing things only from an office and from a capital city and from a background that he had never had before, and that if he had gone up and eyeballed these things himself, had gone up and seen for himself, had talked to people for himself, he was making decisions that I don't think he ever would have if this had been his own from first-hand views.
What was your impression of his brother New? What kind of a man was New?
His brother New was, first of all, a very handsome person. He could have made a career as a leading man in Hollywood. Clean-cut, sort of a boyish charm to him, extremely bright, masterfully intelligent person, a very charming smile, and one to turn the heads of any woman that saw him, because this was happening to some of the American gals who were in Vietnam that I knew, who used to tell me how good-looking the man was. Bright in that he had a good education. He was intellectually ahead of most of the people that he was around at the time, and with that, of course, came an ego that let him look at whatever he said and came to conclusions about as being practically infallible. And I think he was deceiving himself there. He needed an ego to be in the position that he was in, but it finally ran away with him. I think finally he probably thought he was smarter than his brother and knew best for the country what to do more than his brother did. And I think that the family relationship broke down somewhat at that point. I suspect that the long loyalties between the two had become somewhat abraded at the time. Not terribly so, but it was fraying at the time. I last saw the two of them in 1961, and ordinarily I had just seen Diem alone, at least for a period. And Diem had asked me to come in and see him at the palace. And his brother sat there, his brother New sat there in our conversation. And I would ask Jim a question, and his brother would answer it. And I'd say, I didn't ask you, I asked your brother here. And I'd begging Jim to respond directly to his own feelings. And I'd ask him questions about the situation and about some of the rival political figures and some who had been loyal to the government but opposed to Jim personally, so that I could talk about them freely with Jim. And I was quite surprised that the relationship between the two had disintegrated a bit. Now, Jim had been charged by his father to take care of his younger brother, New. So and he was very happy to do so, very proud of looking out for him, very proud of New's intellectual abilities, and boastful a bit about it, as you would be of a younger brother that you felt was really getting ahead. But, pardon me, this had changed somewhat in '61. Of course, the overthrow took place 2 years later, so all I can presume is that this situation must have continued to grow of little difference between the brothers.
What about Madame New?
Madame New is perhaps one of the most tragic figures of our day and age, in that she was a lovely lady who has grown into the image of a tiger lady, of a person of tremendous emotional bitterness, of unguarded tongue, and almost a vicious manner towards others. Madame New came from a very prominent social and political economic family from North Vietnam, and from central North Vietnam, who was brought up by a beautiful mother, a socially elite father group, family group, in which the daughters were trained to make very good marriages, financially and socially, and she knew all of the social graces of a hostess in a household of wealth and culture, so that her training was to be the gracious lady who would invite people and knew how to make conversation at the dinner table, could entertain at the grand piano in the salon, and live a life of quiet charm. She married a man who looked as though this was going to be his life in a colonial Vietnam. But in her more mature days, as she started to have children, as life became more interesting to a gal, she would come in to ask if anybody would like to hear her play a piano in the salon. Her husband was busy with his brother. There was some terrible problem taking place. There might be military types come running in with their problems, and there might be an alarm that the palace was about to be bombed, or something very unladylike taking place, something very unsocial. And the men would say, no, you leave us alone now. So she couldn't act her true role that she had trained for in life. So she tried to move over into their field to be closer to them. And as such, as she loomed into the limelight more and more, she attracted much malevolence and public opinion and so forth, with herself as a target. And I recall talking to her in later years, in which she told me of how much it hurt her all the time to be hated. and she had emotional problems from this feeling of hatred, and this was being expressed in ways that she would see in the press, in conversations and journalistic talks with her and so on. And this hurt her very deeply inside. And I think that a lot of her responses that seem so ugly to us in the context were her attempts to use words that she didn't know quite their fine meanings. I think her talks about barbecuing monks came as she was trying to use American slang with American reporters that were just terribly out of place. And she had been hurt by some of the American diplomats' wives who had become rather catty in her presence about what she was up to. Even her personal sex life was being maligned all the time, that she was sleeping with this, that, or the next general or person in the Vietnamese army, or in the cabinet and so on. But instead of doing such activities, she was in the nursery with the kids and so on. And this hurt.
Some of the Vietnamese generals spread these stories themselves, and we know
To both, it could be. The generals would find it originally possibly to their liking. And some of the Vietnamese generals also looked like Hollywood movie idols, you know, and it helped their image a bit.
Do you think there was nothing to those stories?
I think there might have been friendships between some of these people and Madame New. I'm not an expert on whether what happened when I wasn't around, but when I was there, the behavior was completely acceptable socially, and I didn't see any side glances or touching going on, you know, hands or hips or whatnot. I really don't believe there was anything more to that with the gal.
One thing we tend to overlook is that there were other brothers in that family. And, for example, would you say that the influence of some of the other brothers was very strong on Diem, the bishop, for example?
Some of the other brothers did have influence, and the bishop, the oldest brother in particular. Some of them were out of the country most of the time because Diem trusted them, and he would send them on diplomatic missions. One was at the court of St. James as the Vietnamese ambassador. Another was in France as a very important buffer between the French government and the absentee Emperor Bao Dai, who was down in the Riviera, and Saigon. And one brother, who the youngest of them all, who stayed up and stayed with Mama and kept the family home going up in Hawaii. But the bishop took was a person, first of all, whose activities were out in the countryside. And in his later days, he was down in the south in the Mekong Delta, and frequently in the midst of fighting between the VC and the Vietnamese army. But a man with a very wide acquaintance with the people in the villages and the farmers in the countryside, who would bring this knowledge with him when he talked to his brother, and was very blunt in talking to his brother about what people felt. And sometimes when I was a little worried about too much information one-sidedly coming from Brother New, I would urge him to get his brother, the bishop and later archbishop, and to ask him what was happening there, or to let him go and visit a part of the country and find out his own views on the thing, come back and tell him.
One point about that you haven't mentioned, and that was that you mentioned that Diem was had in many ways a Mandarin outlook. The other thing is that he was a Catholic. which was not a majority religion in Vietnam. Do you think really that he was the kind of man to govern a country that was in a revolutionary situation?
Was Diem the man who, a Catholic of a minority group, a man to lead a country in a revolutionary situation? Let me answer it this way. He was a man who had been in public life before, which few other Vietnamese had been. He had made a name for himself as early on, while he was part of the court at Hue, urged the French to give independence and freedom of action to Vietnamese to govern themselves. This was a very courageous stand that he had taken, and one that was well known throughout the country. For that reason, Ho Chi Minh had urged him to join Ho's government, and it wanted him as a very independent, highly patriotic person. So in Vietnamese eyes, here was a patriot heading the country in times of stress. Now, there surely is nothing wrong with a patriot heading up a government in a revolutionary system or situation. When almost everybody in Vietnam knew that Ho Chi Minh had wanted him into a very important post in the early coalition government that the communists had formed. His shortcomings were those of practically any Vietnamese at the time, since none of them had really held high administrative or executive posts in the country. Many of the Vietnamese who later became ministers or chiefs of departments or bureaus in their government had to sit out practically at the door during French times and be the receptionist. And some of them knew that in this bureau or this department, the main piece of work was to stamp papers. Now, this is what the French had trained them to do, not to run a department, not to run programs, but to sit there and be clerks. And they had a great deal to learn about handling their own affairs and running a government.
One observer in Vietnam, or an American, certainly, Doug Pike once referred to Vietnam as the land of the double cross, in which all Vietnamese are maneuvering against each other, that there's very little cohesion in South Vietnam. Could you comment on that?
Well, Vietnam had its major social problems out of the lack of cohesiveness in its society. There were families, and it's basically a family structure, but once you leave the confines of a village, which is not only the basic unit in Vietnam, politically and socially, but it's perhaps the only place where there is some cohesion, where elected rulers, executives, actually reflect the will of the people and are accepted by the people. Once above that level, there are rivalries afoot, and the xenophobia of a village, of even people from 10 miles away of being dirty foreigners, certainly extends in their, or it did extend in their national political life. So that the mistrust of a foreigner, meaning someone from another province or another city or another town or village, is very evident in their attempts at political organization. Political parties have always had a hard time They no sooner start organizing than they get splinter groups branching off. The political party that Brother New headed and tried to put together to the Can Lao became splintered, but held together principally because there were civil servants who were members, and one person in the civil service would tend to accept another person in the civil service as somebody who was known and not a foreigner. So that was its main strength and also its main weakness, in that to be a member of the club meant that you weren't fired from a government job because you were a member, so that it became, in its membership, a little bit too self-serving of members rather than of the public. And that's where some corruption started in the Diem days. And the real tragedy of Vietnam was that the Vietnamese were never able to get together and rule themselves by accepting others long enough to let them take over the executive job and being accepted by people, even though they elected people. The very last day I was in Saigon in 1968 in the summer, a lot of the small town provincial politicos had wanted to come and say goodbye to me. And a lawyer friend of mine, Vietnamese, had invited them into his home in Saigon. He lived in a very small home on a dirt street. And so many people showed up for this that there was to be a luncheon in his house. That the meeting couldn't take place in his house. It was too small, so we sat down along the curb of this dirt street and talked to each other. And there were several hundred of these politicians from all over the country. And the neighbors came in and brought soft drinks and food for the lunch to us. They were cooked in all these different homes around. And the theme of my farewell to them was, for God's sakes, learn to work with each other. And unless you unify, you're going to lose your country, you're going to lose your homes, and probably lose your lives. But during the thing, I would ask a man what he believed about something. And he would tell me what he believed, and usually very idealistic, highly principled. And several others would be looking at him as he'd do this and say, I never knew that you believed in that. That's what I believe in. And I said, that's the trouble with you. You never talk to each other enough to discover that you share a great deal in common. I got back to my house to finish packing to come back home. And the phone was ringing, and it was then President Thieu. And he wanted to see me right away. I went over to the palace to see him, and he told me that the police his police, he said, had reported to him that I was fomenting a revolution out in the streets with all these politicians from all over the country. And I said, no, I'm doing something I'm very angry at you about. He said, why are you mad at me? I said, it's your job as president of the country to talk to all these people and get them in and get their views and to somehow or other get them working together. And I said, that is a leader's job. And I said, don't let a foreigner, don't let an American like myself do it. I'm leaving. And they were saying goodbye. I'll never see them again, I don't think. So how about you starting to act like a president for a change? And he was quite taken aback by that. And incidentally, turned around then and gave me a painting as a farewell gift. But he said, I thought you were starting a revolution to overthrow me, and I wasn't going to give you this painting until now. So he changed his mind.
Let's go back to the early period. One of Diem's big achievements, maybe it was your achievement too, was how he managed to defeat all these different sects and groups that were trying to overthrow him in the mid-50s. What were these groups?
The sect troubles, which ran a little bit in 1954 late and then got to their climax in the spring of 1955, were two religious sects and one underworld organization of an underworld social type of group in the urban area of Saigon Sholan. The religious groups were the Cao Dai from along the border of Cambodia, about due west of Saigon, and the Hoa Hao, who are a group where recent, just below the so-called Parrots Peak, down near the Gulf of Thailand, southwest of Saigon. And then in the city itself, a sect of the Ben Xuan, who had originally organized as sort of a democratic social club of welfare and so on, but whose leadership had taken over controlling all of the narcotics traffic, mostly opium, all of the prostitution and commercial prostitution and the gambling in the city, and had obtained from Bao Dai the right to select the chief of police of the city area there, the urban area, allegedly for a large sum of money. But they essentially felt that they should control the city and control the country and elect their own people to move in and take charge and run things, rather than a man whom they looked upon in the form of Diem as a Puritan, of a goody-goody, of a person that was really acting against their own personal self-interest. So they met secretly and decided on which one was going to be the boss when they overthrew this man, and who was going to have jurisdiction over what. But they started in, first of all, by trying to negotiate with him. And when Diem wouldn't trust them at all and essentially threw them out of the office and wouldn't talk with them, they decided to use force to force him out. Now, a lot of people were involved in what happened next. The French still had armed forces in the area and moved some more in as this discussion started getting hot. The troops that belonged to these sects, they all had armed forces, an army, were militia in the French army and had been under control of the French almost entirely. There were some exceptions. And the main thought on the other side was if they could get rid of Diem physically by blowing him up, by killing him, they could move in and take over. They moved their troops into the city, positioned mortars to shell the palace, and while both the French forces and the Americans who were there were trying to defuse the situation, trying to bring about a peaceful solution to the thing and resolve some of the claims that the sect forces were making, which included some things that happened at very unfortunate timing. The French said, we are giving our independence to South Vietnam, which means that we can no longer pay militia, which they did at this critical moment. And the sects said, well, somebody's got to pay us, you know, we've got armed forces to help defend the country, and why don't you make me the commander of all the armed forces, one of them said, and we'll take over the defense of Vietnam. And others said, make us part of the Vietnamese army and pay us the same, and we'll take over and run the things. To all of which, of course, Diem said nothing doing. But the French were trying to come up with solutions, and General A. Lee, who was the commander of the French Expeditionary Forces in Indochina, asked me, along with the U.S. ambassador, General Taylor at the time, to, excuse me, it wasn't General Taylor, General Collins, asked me to head up a French-American group to come up with solutions to this problem, which included what do you do with demobilized troops, how do you get them into gainful employment, how you resolve some of the economic needs of the areas where these people come from, and turn them from being belligerents into peaceful citizens. About the time we were wrestling with coming up with the answers to these problems, the Ben Xuan, who were in Saigon and owned essentially Sholan as a gangster territory of theirs, opened fire with mortars on the palace, hoping to catch Diem in a place and kill him. I talked to Diem just before, and I'd gone up to give him a message from both the General A. Lee and Ambassador Collins that we hadn't come up with solutions yet, but we were very hopeful, and we wanted him to hold off precipitating any fight. And Diem was laughing at me. We were out on the front porch, and he said, "You were standing about where I think the first shell is going to hit, and it's going to be coming in about 20 minutes, and you'd better get out of here. And I'm not initiating. I'm receiving here." So, and sure enough, 20 minutes later, the firing broke out against him. And he told me, he was on the phone, he said, "Listen to my orders." And he got General A. Lee on the phone and had him listen. And he said, "Listen to this incoming shells, and I'm giving some orders here for counterfire." And with that, he gave orders to his artillery to open up on the mortars that were firing.
Just a minute. Were you, so it was just a battle. There was no, did they actually fight it out in the streets?
They were fighting in the streets. This took place and started in the evening and went on until almost midnight that day in the dark. And the French had moved forces in to try and control the situation. But what was happening was the Vietnamese army, which by French estimates at the time, and by estimates of some of the Vietnamese in the cabinet even, were that the Vietnamese army wouldn't fight. And they had rushed into Saigon, the Vietnamese army, and I remember seeing one group in front of us in a schoolyard getting ready to move down a few blocks, and I asked them how they were feeling, and they were grabbing their rifles and throwing them in the air and let's go attitude, and just the reverse of what the diplomatic corps had observed, which the French headquarters had said they were. They said that they wouldn't fight and didn't want to, but they were eager to get in and settle a problem.
Were you acting as an advisor to Diem on how to handle the sects?
No. I was seeing Diem about once or twice a week at his invitation, and once in a while I would go in when our ambassador would ask me to go in and convey something to him. He knew that I was working on the sect problem, trying to resolve it. He knew that I was a close friend of one of the sect leaders, who was Trinmente, who was head of the Caudai dissident group that had split away from the regular Caudai, and a close friend of the Commander-in-Chief of the Caudai Armed Forces, and General Fong. And I had asked them not to participate with the others, which they pulled out and didn't do. But on this problem of the thing, I had very strict orders from the U.S. and from our ambassador to not be in the palace when any fighting started, and not to give any military advice on how to cope with the enemy, but to pull out. And Diem was very much aware of this, and I think that was one of the reasons he was teasing me that I was standing where the first shell was going to hit. And he told me where the batteries were and so on. He had excellent intelligence from his brother knew.
Weren't the, I mean, it's generally assumed that the French at that stage were trying to get rid of Diem. Is that true?
The French had a feeling about Diem that was exacerbated by their having lost a war, and by their having to give up a colony and to pull out of a country. And they felt that by having a nationalist, a patriot, if you will, such as Diem heading the government that was supplanting them, that this was sort of rubbing salt into a very sore wound of theirs. And they felt and said frequently that Diem was arousing the people against the French. And a lot of that rubbed off on me, that they also said that I was the one that was trying to arouse a revolutionary spirit among the Vietnamese to be anti-French. And this simply wasn't so at all. I had to remind the French that they had been fighting against Vietnamese for 8 years before I ever showed up on the scene, and that I hadn't started that war or been a part of it, and that this was just a natural consequence of combat. And
now, you had some disagreements, or it's been reported that you had disagreements with the American ambassador, General Collins. What were these disagreements about?
Well, the only one that was sort of...
I'm sorry, did you repeat that you had disagreements?
My only disagreements with Ambassador Collins, General Collins, concerned the matter of the feelings of the Vietnamese on given problems. And one of the times was when the first night of fighting, the sects against the government of Diem, along about 10 or 11 at night, the ambassador asked me to come over to his residence and see him immediately. And I drove in past much of the fighting then going on. The French were bringing up armor to hold strong points in the town, and blocking off Vietnamese army units who were going in to reinforce some people who were some army, their own army units, who were holed up in a police station in Cholan, and needed reinforcements badly. And the French tanks were blocking the way, and I drove on past that up to the ambassador's residence and started telling him that the French were interfering one-sidedly in this fight that was going on. And the ambassador told me that he and General A. Lee had come to an agreement, and the French had the forces there to reinforce and make the decision stick of a truce and ceasefire immediately. Everybody to stay in their positions that where they were, and that he'd gone along. I felt that he had a very misinformed view of what was going on in the town, because he still believed that the Vietnamese army wouldn't fight, that this, in essence, is the truce would give the government of the country, Diem and his people, a chance to sort things out and maybe come up with some viable, workable, peaceful solution of compromise with the other side, when actually the army and Diem had a very viable thing going for them if we'd let them alone.
Was Ambassador Collins cool to the idea of supporting Diem?
I would say so. He didn't.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
General Collins looked upon Diem much as the French did. He was had a close friendship with many of the French officers then in Vietnam. That is, General Collins did. He grew to adopt and accept their viewpoint of Diem as a nationalist who would put his head down and go against anybody's grain just to have his own way, and had no real chance to know him. Usually, when they met personally to talk, Diem would catch something in the ambassador's tone or words that he used that led him to think that this man doesn't know the country or the people or the situation, and at which point Diem would become the professor and educator and take time out to start telling him what the situation really was. And sometimes Diem would talk for hours on this thing and get carried away with a lecture, so that he would lose the attention and interest of a man who wanted to come to a decision quickly and to get something done. So that there was a personal difference between our ambassador and the prime minister, as well as sharing and sympathizing with the French views of it.
Do you think that Diem was